Please join me in welcoming Josh Bolin, who will be leading NCP Foundation's free educational webinar today on DSCSA compliance. Josh brings extensive expertise and will be sharing critical insights around the Drug Supply Chain Security Act requirements. And we are proudly hosting this as part of our commitment to supporting independent pharmacy success through access to education and resources. Josh, welcome. Thank you.
Great. Well, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are, and thank you for the opportunity. Um, so today, I'm going to be uh, going over some slides, some tools, providing information to help navigate DSCSA compliance. There's obviously been a lot of discussion around DSCSA, so I'm going to go into the history, explain why DSCSA exists, talk about some of the current threats to the prescription drug supply chain, but then really focusing in on what pharmacies' compliance obligations are under the DSCSA when you're conducting business with a trading partner. So just to give an idea about some of our learning objectives, I've already mentioned the first one. Second, learning objective is being able to identify the tools that DSCSA provides to detect unsafe medications. And then third and finally, explaining the impact of DSCSA on compounded products. So some pre-test questions that we will hopefully be able to cover as we go through today. True or false, dispensers are required to purchase software or hardware to comply with DSCSA. True or false, dispensers must respond to a regulator request for information during a suspect product investigation within 2 business days. And then true or false, dispensers are obligated to store transaction information for 6 years. And so we'll be covering the answers to these questions as we move forward. So first, the Drug Supply Chain Security Act was actually part two of the Drug Quality and Security Act that was passed in 2013 by Congress. The DSCSA, as it's known, was intended to supersede a growing number of state laws to trace products through the supply chain. The DSCSA laid out that there would be a 10-year implementation in phases, rolling out these requirements from manufacturer down to the ultimate dispensers of products, including pharmacies. And with the ultimate responsibility that when the system is fully electronic and interoperable, the each of the trading partners should be able to gather, send, and receive transaction information and then share that data to help prevent suspect and illegitimate products from making their way to patients. So this gives an idea of what the milestones have been for the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. And first, there was tracking at the T3, so the transaction history, transaction information, and transaction statement at the lot level. A lot of this was done manually or via paper. A lot of it was maintained on invoices. But then over the course of the next several years, manufacturers would then begin to affix serial numbers to saleable units of product. And then they would start tracking that lot level information for the lots, not down to the individual saleable unit of product, but going a step further to begin to affix those serial numbers and the 2D barcodes to the product on down. And then as products begin to move through the supply chain, then you have the ability to actually query about those particular products. And I'll talk about what that looks like here in a few minutes. One of the other really critical requirements that went into effect beyond what was required of the manufacturers was the requirement that that on certain products that are not on certain products rather, but that trading partners must only do business with other authorized trading partners, meaning that you have a requirement and an obligation to make sure that if you're a pharmacy, you're only purchasing products from someone who is authorized under the DSCSA. Now, why is this law needed to begin with? Now, this is actually a more recent example where where you found counterfeit medications that have made their way into the prescription drug supply chain, and in some cases actually reach patients. So if you're pulling you've got the slides up on your screen. If it looks like those are rocks in the bottom left-hand corner, it's because they are. And so, of course, you ask, how on earth does this product actually make its way to a patient or even make its way to a pharmacy with rocks in it? Or, as you see in the middle picture, pills that are clearly not the actual medication that was intended to be in that bottle. Well, how this happened to end up in over 600 unique pharmacies across 36 states is that there was a nationwide counterfeiting scheme that that took place where you had criminals who were actually organized in their effort to obtain legitimate bottles of the HIV medications, Biktarvy and Descovy, and then work to actually insert those products back into the supply chain. How this occurred is these criminals would actually camp out and would buy medications back from patients. So they would camp out outside of HIV specialty pharmacies or HIV clinics and would actually purchase the bottles from the patients, sometimes containing the medications, sometimes not. And in that instance, they would then get those bottles, they would clean the bottles of any patient identifying or pharmacy identifying information, would distribute them to a fly-by-night supplier, and then would introduce those products back into the legitimate supply chain through the secondary market. And then the secondary market would sell to the pharmacy. And in many cases, those products actually made their way to patients. So this gives you an idea of why it's important for the Drug Supply Chain Security Act to actually serialize these products down to the saleable unit to give trading partners and regulators tools to be able to detect these unsafe medications before they enter the supply chain. Now, within the US prescription drug supply chain, and based on how the law is structured, we have what's called a decentralized supply chain. That means that there's no single source of truth of data or truth. There's no one big database of all the transaction information in the cloud or anywhere, so to speak. And that's because the law requires that each trading partner is supposed to store their own serialized data. Each trading partner has to send and receive that serialized data through an electronic and interoperable means. And importantly, for the boards of pharmacy, trading partners are also obligated to respond to requests from federal and state regulators and trading partners as part of investigations into suspect and illegitimate products. So DSCSA, in effect, allows and requires each trading partner to maintain that sovereignty and control over their serialized data. The diagram on the screen shows you how you will have the movement, the physical movement of product from trading partner to trading partner, but then also the electronic transmission of serialized data from trading partner to trading partner as a product moves through the supply chain and towards patients. Now, to put in perspective, like how big this is transitioning from tracing products at the lot level, which is several 100,000 lots being tracked per year, to tracing down to the single saleable unit of product, we'll do a little bit of math to convey the scope of that. So if we assume that there are 4.5 billion units, saleable units of product that are sold each year, so if you're estimating 4.5 billion, if you think about each transaction and the fact that each trading partner has to keep record of that transaction, the manufacturer will keep record of the sale to the wholesaler, and the wholesaler will keep record of the purchase from the manufacturer. So just for that one transaction, there are two transactions records that have to be maintained. But then when you assume that, with each step, there are two transactions, most often it's manufacturer to wholesaler, wholesaler to pharmacy. So that quickly goes from 8 to 10 billion transactions just for one step in the chain to another 16 to 20 billion transactions of instances of transaction information. And pharmacies are obligated, and all trading partners are obligated to keep records for a period of 6 years. So you think about for a single year, you're talking about 100 billion instances of transactions that will have transaction information that will have to be maintained. when you take into account the record retention requirements. So if we're talking about this little red dot here being tracing and tracking that's taking place at that lot level, this is what it looks like when you move toward a fully interoperable and electronic system. 10 to 20,000 times as many DSCSA instances being recorded that have to be maintained. So now, of course, when you think about this type of this volume of information, rather, then the question becomes, okay, well, what tools does DSCSA provide to actually help us get at this information and to detect counterfeit medications? So the first tool that DSCSA provides is it required that product identifiers be affixed to each saleable unit of package, both in machine, so the barcode, and human readable form. So the first is the G10 or the Global Trade Item Number. This item number contains the NDC number as well as identification for the type of package size and the manufacturer of that product. Next, you have the serial number. This is a unique one of one number for this particular G10. You should not see multiple serial numbers for this G10. You should not see the same serial number more than one time for this particular global trade item number. Then you have the expiration date and the lot number, which everyone's familiar with. So again, product identifiers being affixed to the package in a human readable, so letters and numbers, and a machine readable through the two-dimensional barcode. That's how you're able to serialize products down to that saleable unit. But then DSCSA also provides a tool called product verification. So this is where a trading partner can verify the authenticity of the product's identifiers, G10 serial number, lot number, and expiration date with the manufacturer. So what does that mean? That's like asking the manufacturer, did you affix these product identifiers to this package? It's a yes or no response. Yes, they did, and then the product is verified, or no, they didn't, and the product's not verified. So this is one of the other tools that DSCSA provides. And then the other tool is called product tracing. So this is in the event of a suspect or illegitimate product. Product tracing allows a trading partner or a regulator to request the prior ownership of a product by collecting transaction information from trading partners. So this is asking the manufacturer, who did you sell this product to? Or asking the pharmacy, who did you purchase this product from? The requirement for a response here is manufacturers and wholesalers have to respond to a regulator's request within 1 business day, and pharmacies have to respond to a regulator's request within 2 business days to meet their obligation under the law. Now, if I were giving this talk in a room full of people, I would ask, for volunteers to identify what is wrong with this picture. And so for those that were paying attention on the prior slide, you'll notice that we have the same G10 serial number, expiration date, and lot number across all of these products. And so what that means is that there's a problem with this packaging. These 15 cartons of Ozempic were actually part of a shipment of 15,000 cartons that made their way to a wholesale distributor last year here in the United States. So you can see that's a problem. If as a pharmacy, if you ever see a G10 a G10 and the same serial number on the outside of the package, that package should be considered suspect, and you need to set that aside and carry out your obligations under the DSCSA, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So then how does product verification work in practice? And this is where NABP, working with our member boards and a host of other stakeholders, have developed our platform called Pulse by NABP. And so what Pulse enables regulators and moving into next year, what we'll be making available at no cost to pharmacies is the ability to actually utilize a smartphone to scan the 2D barcode of a product and to conduct that product verification, to ask the manufacturer, did you affix these identifiers to this package? And so this is within our test system. So this gives you an idea of how, you can just use your smartphone and Pulse to be able to scan the 2D barcode of the product and verify a product. Now this, because it's in our test system, came back as an error. But I can show you what this would look like in our production environment where you would get a green indicator that the product's verified or a red indicator that the product is not verified. So Pulse at its core is a digital directory for all of the products that move through the supply chain, as well as all of the trading partners that participate, including manufacturers, wholesalers, 3PLs, and pharmacies. So taken together, what that does is it unlocks the ability for a pharmacy, for a trading partner to scan the 2D barcode of the product and then find the right entity within the supply chain to ask those questions about that product. Now, as I said, we've been engaging with large and small manufacturers, distributors, and dispensers. Our members have been very active in participating in Pulse. And as it happens, we actually have some examples of how Pulse has been utilized really the first day that we launched it to help detect some unsafe medications. So this gives you an idea of how, excuse me, this gives you an idea of how, because we have that decentralized supply chain, how we've created this directory of products and directory of trading partners to help facilitate communication about the products that move through the supply chain. Now, as I mentioned before, one of the key components that NABP has been working on is building out these tools to enable our members to be able to detect substandard, falsified, counterfeit, suspect products and keep them from reaching patients. Excuse me. Now, NABP had announced our plans to actually launch product verification for regulators on January 15th of this year. Well, on January 13th, which was a Monday, we actually got a call from a board of pharmacy, and that board of pharmacy explained that they recognized the credentials weren't being sent out until later that week, but that they had inspectors in a pharmacy at that very moment and had a product that they believed to be suspect, and they wanted to be able to conduct a product verification of that product and initiate their investigation. And so we were able to work with that board of pharmacy to get them the credentials. And then we didn't hear anything until the next day when we got a call from a different board of pharmacy with the same query, identifying that they were in a pharmacy and needed to get the product verification tool so they could actually conduct a verification. And so, as it turns out, the very first scans that were conducted utilizing Pulse actually identified products that were unsafe. They were suspect products that were believed to be illegitimate and turned out to be part of a multi-state instance where unsafe medications and, in some instances, counterfeited medications actually made their way into the legitimate supply chain. And so, how does this happen? Well, first, it usually starts with something like this, where you receive a solicitation, maybe a fax, maybe an email with an offer that's too good to be true, or maybe it's just a good offer. Um, and I can tell you, this is not an uncommon thing that we hear about from our members in terms of these types of advertisements. And this is an instance where, counterfeiters and criminals are going to continue, to prey upon the demand for this particular type of product, but also products that are a bit more expensive, perhaps, or more valuable, and there's a higher return on that criminal's investment of trying to infiltrate our legitimate supply chain with illegitimate and unsafe products. And so in this particular instance, there were a number of products that were seized in both instances. Some where you actually had the seizure of a legitimate package or even of a legitimate injector pen that maybe just didn't have legitimate product inside. You also had others where you would have the injector pins that were doctored up or were clearly not the regular official branded either carton or the injector pin itself. Suffice to say that counterfeiters and criminals are getting more sophisticated, and that requires more vigilance on the part of the pharmacy community as a whole. What I would also say, however, is that while yes, you may get these types of advertisements, there are some simple things that you can do that you also are obligated by law to do that will help protect you, your supply chain, and your patients. So just to provide a highlight, so as of right now, NABP, our Pulse product verification system, we have over 120 state regulators and representatives from the Drug Enforcement Administration that are registered in Pulse. This represents roughly 30 states. We are continuing to onboard new states every single week, and we've had roughly 1,600 verification requests as part of suspect product investigations that have been made. And so this gives you an idea just even though we're still very early days in implementing, this was a tool that NABP's worked really hard to bring to bear for our members. And so we're proud that it's been able to make a positive impact. But we're also even more excited to see how we can roll the tool out to the pharmacy community, and in particular, the independent pharmacy community. Because one, there is not a requirement that pharmacies that you have to buy certain hardware or software in order to comply with DSCSA. But I will say that DSCSA only works if the tools are available and accessible. And so that's why NABP wants to provide product verification tools at no cost to the dispenser community because the system will only work if everyone's participating. Now, as of right now, now to kind of shift more toward your pharmacy obligations, just to let you know where we are within the DSCSA implementation. So obviously, the law passed in 2013 was supposed to go into full force and effect in 2023, but that as that time approached, I think FDA decided that there was going to need to be a period of stabilization. And so in August of 2023, FDA announced that there would be a 1 year stabilization period. Then over the course of that year from 2023 to 2024, FDA had a series of listening sessions where they were trying to understand from the community where things were in terms of implementation. And after those listening sessions, they ultimately decided that they would do sort of a phased final implementation period where manufacturers and repackagers that they would have until May 27th of 2025 to comply, and that wholesalers would have until August 27th of 2025 to comply. So we've already passed those two dates. FDA has not provided any additional exemptions or exceptions for those two groups. And the next date that is coming up is for dispensers with 26 or more full-time employees. That exemption period ends in November 27th of this year. And for small dispensers, so those with 25 or under full-time employees, meaning pharmacists, pharmacy technicians, and the like, that those smaller dispensers with 25 or fewer have until November 27th of 2026 to fully comply with the DSCSA. Now, that said, that doesn't mean that there aren't obligations that pharmacies already have to be in compliance with, because some of your compliance obligations actually started as early as 2015. So to get into that a little bit, and these are some of the just basics. I'm going to go over a lot of detail over the next couple of slides, but I have a few finishing slides that I think really hit home what obligations you need to be worried about right now, and then what you need to be planning for. So first and foremost, having written policies and procedures that detail your initial and ongoing process for checking the licenses of your upstream trading partner. So that means checking the state license and checking to see if they've reported to the FDA database. Your policies and procedures should also document the frequency, document the last date checked, and document where you're actually checking that for that information on your upstream trading partners. So from a product identification perspective, knowing, are you visually examining those products when they come in the door? Is there anything wrong with the product identifiers? Does something look amiss with the packaging? Just before you receive those things into inventory, what is your process for receiving into inventory? And then importantly, what do you do if you find something that looks like it could be suspect? And more on that in a few slides. So the other obligation under DSCSA is that dispensers must provide and receive transaction information and transaction statements in a secure, electronic, and interoperable manner. So you have to receive that transaction information from your trading partners. Now, this is important because I know there are a number of there are service providers out there that can help store transaction information, and many of you can also utilize your wholesaler to store that transaction information for you. And that's completely fine as long as you know where it's being stored and as long as you can access it for a period of at least for a period of not less than 6 years. And then, as we mentioned before, you have to describe your process for responding to a request for transaction information from a state or federal regulator when they're conducting an investigation into a suspect or illegitimate product. So again, having detailed policies and procedures that explain, what to do in each of these instances is should be core to what you all have in your SOPs. Now, another distinction between our traceability system here and a traceability system in other parts of the world is we have a very much reactive traceability system. Your obligations start if you have reason to believe or credible evidence that something is counterfeit, diverted, stolen, subject to a fraudulent transaction, and so on. So if you have reason to believe, you're supposed to stop, set that item aside, and then conduct an investigation to determine whether you actually have credible evidence and proof that there is something suspect about the product, or whether that product is eventually cleared and then you can reinsert it into your inventory. So importantly, you have to document that. So what process do you have? When you find something as suspect, what is it that you do to actually set that product aside, to quarantine that product, and then take the steps to actually verify those identifiers for that product. Now, to verify a product, you could utilize a tool like what NABP is going to make available, or you can simply pick up the phone and call the manufacturer. All the manufacturers have established uh, hotlines, email addresses that will enable you to, get in touch with them to verify the identifiers of that product. But in the event that you do find that credible evidence that something is counterfeit, diverted, stolen, subject to a fraudulent transaction, and so on, you have an obligation under the law to alert your trading partners of that fact. So the person you purchased the product from, or the entity you purchased the product from, and complete and submit a form FDA 3911 within 24 hours from the moment that you determine something to be illegitimate. Now, distributors and solution provider support. So first, wholesalers can store transaction information, but only for the products that they sell you, i.e., they could do this through a portal or other electronic means, but they can store them for you. They can also provide you with standard operating procedures on how to utilize their portal and how to get access to it. But they can't store information for products sold to you by other wholesalers, and they can't conduct suspect and illegitimate product investigations for their pharmacy customers. This has to be completed by you as the pharmacy that purchased the product. And then finally, and to reemphasize this point, you are not required to use a solution provider or a particular type of technology to comply with the DSCSA. Upstream trading partners who maybe you have a lot of upstream trading partners that could make it a little bit more challenging to comply with who's storing what transaction information. But you are not obligated to use any particular type of hardware or software to comply with the law. You can still do things very manually if that's what works best for your business. Just a quick note on DSCSA and compounding. So the products that are subject to tracing are a subset of prescription drugs. And importantly, and just to emphasize this, Products which are subject to tracing requirements under DSCSA do not include drugs compounded in compliance with sections 503A and 503B. So compounded drugs are not products. They are not subject to the traceability requirements in DSCSA. Now, similarly, APIs are considered prescription drugs in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, but they're not defined as products. So APIs are not traced as a requirement under DSCSA. And API sellers are not required to provide transaction information and are not subject to tracing. But APIs, must be sourced from authorized sources. So those that are either FDA registered and state licensed if state licensure is triggered. So some more on this and just to kind of dig down. Now, if you are using a product that's procured for use in compounding, the point at which you get ready to break that product down and utilize it for compounding, transaction information still has to travel with it. But once you compound that product, it doesn't have to travel any further. You don't have to provide additional tracing information, but you do have to store transaction information for products that are used in compounding, but not for the final compounded product itself. So again, I know I've covered a lot, and I know this sort of discussion can be a little bit dry from time to time. So I want you, if you take nothing else away from this presentation, these are the four major components that you should be implementing right now that will have you well on your way toward compliance with DSCSA, irrespective of whether you have to be compliant in November of 2025 or compliant in November of 2026. First and foremost, know your prescription drug suppliers, your sources. Who are you purchasing products from? You have to have a vetting process for them to check their license, to check to see that they are reporting to the FDA at least annually, and then documenting that process. I can tell you both of the instances that we shared earlier where we had the states that called identifying the suspect product that ended up being illegitimate and counterfeit. In both of those instances, those pharmacies didn't follow rule number one here. They weren't checking their prescription drug suppliers and sources. And so if you're doing the very first and frankly simplest thing that you can do is when you're sourcing your prescription drugs, make sure you're only doing business with trading partners that are authorized. That means being licensed in the state and then reporting to the FDA. So that's number one. Number two, knowing where your product tracing or your transaction information data is being stored and how to access it, and have a policy and procedure that spells that out. So if you're utilizing your wholesaler's portal, have a policy and procedure that says, I am utilizing my wholesaler's portal to store this transaction information, and here's how I go about getting that. And importantly, here's how I go about getting it if a state or a federal regulator asks for it. Again, that's number two. So number one, knowing your suppliers. Number two, knowing where your product tracing data is. Number three, knowing what suspect product is, how to identify it, how to investigate it, and what to do if it's deemed illegitimate. FDA has fantastic guidance on on suspect products on their website. I've got some links that I'll share in a few minutes that will point you to that. Those are the big three. If you are doing these three things, you are well on your way to complying with the DSCSA. And frankly, these are all things you're supposed to be doing right now anyway. Um, and then fourth and finally, developing, updating, and adhering to robust prescription drug purchasing policies and procedures that actually reflect your internal processes. So I know there are consultants out there, there are other groups that may, help package together policies and procedures, and that's fine. Just make sure that they actually reflect what you do and that you're training and educating your staff on them, and that they are, again, reflective of your actual practice. So along those lines, earlier this year, NABP released our dispenser guide to achieving DSCSA compliance. You can actually sign up to get this guide by going on to pulse.pharmacy and signing up for additional information, and then we'll send you an electronic copy of this guide. It really focuses on, like, yes, it has examples of what you need to be doing, but it does focus on these operational imperatives and how to build sound practices around these. I will tell you, I would not recommend, however, that you like throw your name on this and say, this is my policy and procedure. This should be used to guide your development of your own policies and procedures and what you need to be doing from that perspective. So then finally, some FDA resources, and I'd like to call out, a couple. First, that FDA, the different guidances, policy documents that are out there. The one for suspect products is definitely worth a read because it gives you a lot of examples of what to be looking for when you're making an assessment of a product. www.dscsa.pharmacy. This is a collaborative website that NABP has partnered to build with NCPA, with the Healthcare Distribution Alliance, NACDS, APHA, ASHP, PDG, PDSA, the full alphabet soup of pharmacy organizations. But view this as being a trusted source where you can go to get educational content on DSCSA. As I mentioned on the prior slide, pulse.pharmacy, this link can be used to actually sign up to get that dispenser education guide that we have. And then we have some other reports just about the other types of work that NABP's done over the course of the past couple of years in this space. And so finally, to go back to our pre-test questions, true or false, dispensers are required to purchase software or hardware to comply with DSCSA. This is false. You are not required to purchase hardware or software to comply with DSCSA. Dispensers must respond to a regulator request for information during a suspect product investigation within two business days. That is true. And then finally, dispensers are obligated to store transaction information for 6 years. That is also true. So with that, that is the end of the formal presentation. I'm going to jump into the Q&A and see if there are any questions. I think Leah had a question about whether the slides will be available. Yes, we'll make these slides available. Absolutely. There is not, to my knowledge, an explicit requirement in the DSCSA that requires scanning in order to verify products into inventory. That's the response there. I believe some solution providers or others may have made their own interpretations, but that's not our understanding. That's right. While I will say there are some educational resources on NABP's website and at pulse.pharmacy that everyone's welcome to look at. You've also got dscsa.pharmacy, but we'll absolutely be pushing those slides out through NCPA. And also those of you that may be attending the NCPA annual meeting, NABP is actually giving a DSCSA presentation in New Orleans next month, I believe that is as well. Yep. So 340B is a challenging aspect to DSCSA. 340B doesn't change the fundamentals of the fact that DSCSA is an ownership law, and there has to be tracking of serialized saleable units of product from owner to owner. And so when you start to think about how replenishment models may work, that stands potentially in conflict. Again, the best advice that I can give is to make sure that wherever you fall within the supply chain, that you are documenting that when you're receiving transaction information for a product, that you have record of that and that who that product was received from. And then if for some reason you're selling that product further down, that you have documentation for who you're selling that to. But 340B is one of the biggest challenges in terms of how replenishment model works versus versus the other models? Those questions. Okay. Um, Sonia, I don't know if we have anything else. It doesn't look like there are any more questions. All right.
Anybody else? All right. Thank you all so much. And especially thank you to you, Josh. This information was so valuable. And I know I learned an incredible amount. And it's always amazing to see how many things happen in the pharmacy world that we're not always privy to as patients. So thank you guys all for all the work you do and for keeping all patients safe and keeping access to healthcare. It means a lot to us.
Thank you all for the opportunity. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks. Goodbye.